A girl flees in the darkness. No shoes, no phone, no one to save her. Behind her are men with guns. In front of her is a man more dangerous than all of them combined. And the worst part? That man isn't her worst enemy. The worst is the man who called her his daughter for 24 years. This is the story of a blood debt, an incorrigible criminal, and a woman who survived hell, and then walked straight into another hell. Like and comment the city you're viewing to let me know how far my story has progressed. And don't go anywhere because this is just the beginning. The parking structure smelled like rust and old motor oil and something else. Something copper and warm that Elena Vale recognized as her own blood before she even raised her hand to her face. She ran anyway, bare feet slapping against black concrete, each step sending a jolt up through her ankles, her shins, into the knot of pure animal fear lodged somewhere between her stomach and her throat. The cut above her left eyebrow was the least of her problems. She knew that. She'd known that from the moment she grabbed the flash drive off Vincent's desk and heard the door to the stairwell bang open 3 floors above her. They were faster than she expected. She'd always known they would come. Known it the way you know a storm is coming when the air pressure drops and the birds go quiet. Not a conscious thought, just a pressure in the chest that never fully went away. For 3 months after her father disappeared, Elena had been waiting, paying her rent, working double shifts at the bar on Whacker, telling herself that whatever Vincent Vale had done, whatever hole he'd dug for himself with other people's money, it wasn't her problem. She'd been wrong about that too. The parking structure was 7 levels underground, connected to the Vescari Tower by a service corridor that most people didn't know existed. Elena knew about it because she'd worked a catering job in the tower lobby 2 years ago and spent a smoke break talking to a maintenance guy who'd had too much to drink and too much to say. She'd filed the information away the same way she filed away everything useful, quietly, without making a show of it, in that part of her brain that her mother had once called her survival instinct and her father had called her sneakiness, depending on his mood. She hit the elevator bank at a dead run and stabbed the button with her thumb. The display above the center elevator showed it descending. 42, 39, 36. Behind her, the stairwell door burst open. 2 of them. Big men in dark coats, the kind of coats that hung wrong at the shoulder because of what was underneath. One of them had a phone pressed to his ear. The other had something in his hand that caught the fluorescent light in a way that made Elena's vision go white at the edges. She hit the button again. 30, 27. Don't run. The one with the phone held up his free hand, palm out, like she was a horse he was trying not to spook. We're not going to hurt you. Elena had heard variations of that sentence before. It never meant what people thought it meant. 22, 19. Your father took something that doesn't belong to him, the man continued, walking toward her with that careful, measured pace. You don't have to be part of this. I'm not part of anything, Elena said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Old habit. Then put the drive down and walk away. 15, 12. You'll let me walk away? We'll let you walk away. She looked at him for a second, just one, long enough to read the thing behind his eyes that his voice was working so hard to hide. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open. Elena turned and stepped inside, and the first thing she registered was that the elevator was not empty. He was standing in the back left corner with his hands in the pockets of a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elena made in 3 months. Dark hair, cut close on the sides. A jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and healed crooked, just slightly, in a way that should have made him look damaged, but somehow only made him look more deliberate. Like everything about him had been tested and reassembled according to spec. He was watching her with eyes the color of old iron, and he was completely, utterly still. Elena's feet stopped moving. The elevator doors started to close behind her. One of the men outside made a sound. Not quite a word, more like a breath that got caught on something. And then the doors shut, and the only sound was the hum of the cable and Elena's own heart doing something irregular against her ribs. The man in the corner did not reach for her, did not speak. He simply looked at her the way you look at a piece of information you're not quite sure what to do with yet. Elena became acutely aware of what she looked like. Bare feet on marble, blood running in a thin line down the left side of her face and dripping off her jaw. her blouse torn at the shoulder where one of them had grabbed her outside the bar 40 minutes ago before she'd gotten loose. The flash drive still clenched so hard in her fist that the casing had left an impression in her palm. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Which floor?" he said. The question was so ordinary that it took her a second to process it. She stopped, recalibrated. "I need to get out of this building." "That's not a floor." "Lobby, street level, whatever gets me outside." He didn't move to press a button. He was still watching her with that flat, measuring attention, and Elena realized with a cold clarity that he already knew exactly who she was and why she was bleeding and what she was holding in her hand, and that he had known all of this before the doors opened, and that the elevator was already moving. But it was not moving down. It was moving up. "You pressed the wrong button," Elena said. "I didn't press any button." She turned and looked at the panel. No floor was lit. The elevator moved anyway, smooth and controlled, 40 stories of glass and steel cable rising without any instruction that she could see. "Where are we going?" she said. It didn't come out as a question. The man finally moved, just his head, a slight tilt, like he was considering how much of the truth to extend to her. "Up," he said. "I figured that part out." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement. More like the precursor to it, the way a pressure drop precedes a change in weather. "You have something that belongs to me," he said. Elena's hand tightened around the drive. "I don't know what's on this." "That's probably true." "Then you know it's not worth anything to me. I just grabbed it because—" She stopped. She didn't owe him an explanation. She didn't owe him anything. "Because I needed something to run with." "Running with my property," he said, "has a cost." The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto a floor that was not a lobby, not a parking structure, not any floor that a normal occupant of this building would ever see. It was a reception area that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that real power didn't announce itself. Cream walls, low lighting, a single security desk where a man sat with the posture of someone who had done serious violence in the past and expected to do it again in the future. Elena did not move. "My name is Damian Vescari," the man in the suit said. The way he said it was not an introduction. It was more like setting down a weapon on a table so you could see its weight. "And you are Elena Vale, Vincent's daughter, the one he left behind when he ran." Her stomach dropped about 3 inches. "You know my father." "I know what he took from me." He stepped out of the elevator. When he turned back to look at her, one hand resting against the door frame to hold it open, his expression had settled into something careful and completely without warmth. $8 million, 4 years of laundered accounts, and whatever is on that drive, which I suspect is considerably more valuable than either. Elena stood inside the elevator and looked at the man, and the man looked back at her, and she thought about what was below her. Parking levels, concrete, the 2 men in dark coats who were probably already riding another elevator up. And she thought about what was above her, which she couldn't see yet, and she thought about her father, who was somewhere she didn't know with money that wasn't his. And she thought about her own feet, bare and cold on elevator marble. And she did the math the only way she'd ever learned how to do math, which was fast and without sentiment. She stepped out of the elevator. Damian Vescari let the doors close behind her. They gave her shoes. That was the first thing. A pair of flat-soled slippers that someone produced from somewhere, a closet, a drawer, she didn't see where, and set in front of her on the floor of a room that was half office, half observatory, the entire north wall a sheet of glass that looked out over Chicago in the middle of a rainstorm. The city below was a smear of orange and white, and the particular wet darkness that came with November rain, and Elena stood in front of it with her arms wrapped around herself and her face cleaned up by a woman who hadn't spoken a single word while she worked, and hadn't looked Elena in the eye once. Damian Vescari sat behind a desk that held exactly 3 things: a laptop, a glass of water, and the flash drive, which he'd taken from her somewhere between the elevator and the office, and which Elena was only now realizing she'd let go of without a fight. She didn't remember handing it over. That bothered her more than the blood had. "Your father opened those accounts in 2019, Damian said. He wasn't looking at the laptop. He was looking at her. He was supposed to be managing offshore distribution for 3 of my business ventures, Instead, he was skimming, small amounts at first, then larger. Then last spring, he moved everything, all of it, 8.2 million, into a set of accounts I've spent 6 months trying to trace. I haven't spoken to my father in 4 years, Elena said. I know. Then you know You're not his accomplice, Damian said. That's already been established. You're his daughter, which is something else entirely. One of his men was in the room, not the two from the parking structure, a different one, older, with a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, and a face that had stopped being surprised by anything sometime around 2003. He was standing near the door with his hands clasped in front of him and had not moved since Elena came in. Reyes, Damian said. The man near the door straightened slightly. She's the daughter of Vincent Vale, Reyes said, and his voice had the flat, informational quality of someone reading from a document. The accountant who moved the Caracas funds before disappearing. We've been watching her for 2 months. Watching me, Elena repeated. We needed to know if you were in contact with him, Damian said. Not apologetic, just factual. And? You're not. Elena looked at him. So then what am I? Damian leaned back in his chair. He had the kind of stillness that wasn't calm. It was control, which was different, the kind of stillness that came from having learned a long time ago that the first person to move usually lost. His eyes stayed on her face, and Elena had the deeply uncomfortable sensation of being read, of every micro-expression and defensive posture being catalogued and filed. You're a blood debt, he said finally. Elena laughed. It came out shorter and harsher than she intended. I'm not my father's debt. In my world, you are. Then your world is wrong. Something moved across his face, too fast to catch, gone before she could name it. He looked down at the drive for a moment, then back at her. What do you know about the flash drive? He said. Nothing. I told you. You grabbed it off a desk while running for your life. You knew it mattered. I knew it was the only thing in that apartment that might give me leverage, she said. I didn't know what was on it. I still don't. It contains financial records, he said. Not mine. A network of accounts tied to people considerably more dangerous than me. He paused, and the pause had weight to it. Your father was not only stealing from me, he was also selling information to people who would very much like this drive to disappear, along with anyone who touched it. The rain hammered the window. Below them, 40 stories down, Chicago moved through its night without any awareness that anything significant was happening up here. Elena thought about that. The way you think about a thing when you're trying to determine whether the person telling it to you is telling it for your benefit or for theirs, and whether that distinction matters. So I'm in danger, she said. Yes. From the people my father sold information to. Among others. And you're offering to protect me. I'm offering you a choice, Damian said, which is more than your father offered the people he stole from. What choice? He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, and coming to his full height, he was taller than she'd registered in the elevator, broader in the shoulder, and the suit sat on him like armor that happened to be expensive. 3 years, he said. You remain under my roof, under my protection. You do not contact the outside without my knowledge. You do not attempt to locate your father or make arrangements to pass information to anyone outside this network. He moved around the desk, not toward her, just into the room, like he was giving her space and closing it simultaneously. In exchange, I keep the people hunting Vincent's information away from you, and at the end of 3 years, the debt is cleared. You walk out with a new identity, enough money to start somewhere clean, and no one from this world will ever look for you again. Elena stood in front of the window with the rain behind her and looked at Damian Vescari and thought about what 3 years meant when you were 24. Thought about what the alternative looked like. The men in the parking structure, the information on that drive, people considerably more dangerous. Thought about the apartment she wouldn't be going back to, the bar shifts she wouldn't be working, the careful ordinary life she'd constructed out of nothing that had just been demolished in the space of one rainy Tuesday night. And if I say no, she said, then Reyes drives you to the street and you're on your own. Damian's voice didn't change. And you'll be dead within 48 hours. You sound certain. I am. She looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away. 3 years, she said. 3 years. I'm not doing anything illegal. That's negotiable. It's not. Something shifted in him again. That same fast movement behind the eyes, there and gone. Fine, he said. And I'm not. She stopped, started again. I have conditions. You're not in a position for conditions. I'm in the only position I've got, Elena said, which is the position where I know that drive matters to you, and I'm the only person in this room who didn't know what was on it before tonight, which means I'm the only person in this room that your enemies can't buy. She watched him. So yes, I have conditions. Damian Vescari looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, and then he said very quietly, Go on. She told him what she needed. Her own room, lockable from the inside. No one enters without her permission. Access to books, to the internet with reasonable restrictions she'd accept in writing. The right to say no to any social obligation without explanation. And one phone call, monthly, to a woman named Carla, who was the closest thing Elena had to a friend in the world, just to confirm she was alive. No details, no location. Damian listened to all of it without expression. Then he said yes to 3 of the 4, the phone call being the one he revised. She could have it, but Reyes would be present and the call would be monitored. She agreed. It wasn't ideal. It was survivable. They shook hands in front of the window with the rain coming down and Chicago burning orange below them, and Elena thought, clearly and without drama, that she had just made a deal with the most dangerous person she'd ever met, and that the most terrifying part wasn't the danger. The most terrifying part was the way he'd looked at her wrist when she extended her hand. The sleeve of her torn blouse had ridden up just slightly, exposing the pale underside of her forearm and the old burn scars that lived there. 3 of them, circular, deliberate. He noticed. She saw him notice. He shook her hand anyway and said nothing, and that silence landed on her chest like a stone. The room they gave her was on the 38th floor, northeast corner, with 2 windows and a lock on the inside that she tested 6 times before she was willing to get close to the bed. The sheets were white and expensive, and Elena sat on the edge of the mattress in the slippers and the borrowed clothes someone had left outside the door and stared at the wall and listened to the rain. The estate on Lake Michigan was where they moved her the next morning. She hadn't expected the size of it. The Vescari Tower was power-made vertical, glass and altitude, and the particular loneliness of height. The Lake Michigan property was something different. A compound, really, spread across 4 acres of private shoreline north of the city, surrounded by trees that had been deliberately left thick along the perimeter, and a security system that she cataloged in pieces over the first 3 days without making it obvious she was doing so. Cameras at the gates and every corner. Motion sensors along the tree line. 2 permanent guards at the main entrance, rotating shifts at the secondary entrance near the boathouse. The house itself was modern. Concrete and steel and glass, the same vocabulary as the tower but lower, wider, built into the landscape rather than above it. Cold in the way that spaces are cold when they've been designed by someone who understood precision more than warmth. Clean lines, expensive emptiness, rooms that felt like they'd been staged for a photograph and never quite recovered from it. Elena had lived in worse places than cold and precise. She unpacked the few things they'd retrieved from her apartment, her clothes, her notebooks, the broken-spined paperback copy of a crime novel she'd read 3 times because she'd never gotten around to replacing it, and arranged them in the room she'd been given the same way she always arranged things in new rooms, which was neatly and with clear sight lines to both the door and the window. Old habit. Older than she liked to think about. The first week she did not see Damian at all. She ate meals in a kitchen staffed by a woman named Petra, who communicated entirely through nods and the quality of the food she produced, which was exceptional. She walked the parts of the property she was permitted to walk, which excluded the boathouse, the east wing, and a locked room on the 2nd floor whose door she'd tried once, casually, passing, and found solid steel behind a normal-looking panel. She read. She slept badly. On the 8th morning, Damian appeared at breakfast without announcement, sitting across from her at a table built for 12, with coffee and a newspaper, an actual printed newspaper, which struck her as a deliberate anachronism, and said, without looking up, You've been mapping the security system. Elena poured her coffee. Yes. He turned a page. Find anything useful? The blind spot at the northeast corner of the grounds. The camera rotation that leaves the boathouse door unwatched for 40 seconds every 8 minutes. The fact that your overnight shift changes at 3 a.m., and there's a 6-minute gap where the east gate is technically unmanned. Damian set down the newspaper. He looked at her with that iron-colored attention. And? He said. And nothing, Elena said. I'm not trying to run. I shook your hand. A lot of people shake my hand. I know what my word means, she said. Do you want to know where the blind spots are? Or not? A pause. Yes, he said. So she told him, and he listened without interrupting. And when she was done, he called Reyes and gave instructions in a voice too low for her to catch. And then he picked up his newspaper again and said, without looking at her, You have a talent for this. For what? Seeing systems, finding where they break. It's just math, Elena said. Everything is math if you look at it long enough. He looked at her over the top of the newspaper, just for a second. Finish your coffee, he said. I want to show you something. What he showed her was the money. Not literally, not stacks of bills in a basement, nothing so blunt. What he showed her was the architecture of it, the elegant, invisible machinery by which criminal money became legitimate money, became investment returns and charity endowments and political donations and the kind of wealth that got your name on the side of a library. He laid it out for her in his office in the East Wing. The one she'd been excluded from, she noted, which told her something about what she was being trusted with now, using documents and spreadsheets and a whiteboard that he wrote on with the shorthand fluency of someone who'd spent years building something nobody was supposed to see. Elena sat across from him and watched and listened and felt the specific quality of attention she got around numbers, which was absolute and involuntary and had gotten her through 2 years of community college on a scholarship she'd fought for and a job keeping books for 3 different small businesses simultaneously before she'd given up on legitimate employment being enough to survive on. The auction network is the cleanest, she said, about 40 minutes in, without meaning to say it out loud. Damian stopped writing. What did you say? The luxury auction channel, she pointed to a section of the whiteboard. The other 2 have traceable patterns if you look at the transaction timing. The auctions are randomized enough that the intervals don't cluster. It's the hardest one to flag algorithmically. She paused. Although if someone was looking specifically at the buyer profiles, they'd find the repetition. Silence. The buyer profiles repeat, she said. You're using too many of the same shell entities cycling through. If the intervals are random but the participants aren't, a smart analyst would catch it. Damian set down his marker. He looked at her for a long time. How long did it take you to see that? He said. About 20 minutes, Elena said. I was waiting to see if you'd notice I noticed. Something happened in his face then. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was the recalibration of a person who has just learned that the object they were examining is more complicated than it appeared. He picked the marker back up, uncapped it, and wrote 3 words at the top of a clean section of the whiteboard. Then he handed the marker to Elena. Show me, he said. She stood and took the marker, and for the next 2 hours she did exactly that. And Damian Vescari stood beside her and watched her work with an expression she couldn't quite read, but that felt, at its edges, like something she didn't have a precise word for. Later, walking back through the main corridor to the residential wing, Elena passed the tall mirror near the staircase and caught her own reflection without meaning to. The bruising around her eye had shifted from purple to the brownish yellow of healing. The cut had closed. She looked like herself mostly, except for something around the eyes that she didn't examine too closely. She paused, pushed her sleeve up to the elbow, looked at the burn scars in the light of the corridor. When she looked up, Damian was reflected behind her in the glass. Standing in the hallway. He'd followed at a distance and stopped when she stopped, and he was looking at her reflection with an expression she had never once in her life seen on anyone's face when they looked at those scars. Not pity, not revulsion, not the particular brand of uncomfortable curiosity she'd learned to dread. Something rawer than any of those things. Something she had no category for. She pulled her sleeve down. He said nothing. She walked to her room and locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to her own heartbeat for a long time. 3 years, she thought. She was beginning to understand that 3 years with Damian Vescari was going to be a very different thing than she'd calculated in that 40-story elevator with rain hammering the glass and blood running down her face. The question that kept her awake, the one she couldn't math her way out of, was whether different meant better, or whether it meant something she didn't have a word for yet. She was still lying there, still awake, still asking that question when her door opened. Not from outside. She'd locked it from inside. And only she had the key. The door didn't swing open. It eased, slowly, the way someone moves when they're trying to determine whether the person on the other side is awake or asleep before they commit to either direction. Elena was off the bed before she'd made a conscious decision to move. On her feet, back against the wall beside the window, the lamp from the nightstand already in her right hand, base up, the way you hold something when you intend to use it and not just threaten with it. The door opened fully. Reyes stood in the frame with the keycard in his hand and an expression that didn't change when he saw the lamp. "There's a problem," he said. Elena didn't lower the lamp. "You just let yourself into my room." Mr. Vescari said, "I had a lock," she said. "From the inside. That was the agreement." The agreement also assumed you'd answer when knocked on. Reyes's voice was the same temperature it always was, which was approximately the temperature of a February sidewalk. "You didn't answer." "I was thinking. For 40 minutes. She set the lamp down. Not because she trusted him, because the adrenaline was converting into something more usable and she needed her hands free to think clearly. "What problem?" she said. Reyes stepped aside. Behind him in the corridor stood a man she hadn't seen before. Younger than Reyes, maybe 30, with a split lip and the particular glassy look of someone operating on the far edge of their own panic. His jacket was wet from the rain, which meant he'd come in from outside recently, and he was holding his left arm against his body at an angle that meant something was wrong with the shoulder. "He came to the east gate," Reyes said. "Asked for you specifically." Elena looked at the man. He looked back at her, and his eyes focused with the effort of someone hauling themselves up through deep water. "Marco," she said. Not a greeting. A recognition. Marco Tevis had worked with her father for 11 years. She'd met him maybe 4 times, always at a distance, the kind of peripheral figure who existed in her awareness the way smoke exists. You registered it without looking directly at it. He was the man Vincent Vale called at 2 a.m, the man who answered questions that didn't have official channels. "Elena," his voice was wrecked. "Your father... I need to tell you something about your father." "You need a hospital," she said. "Later." He shook his head and winced at the movement. He didn't run. The corridor was very quiet. "What?" Elena said. "Vincent?" He didn't run voluntarily. Marco's breathing was shallow, deliberate, the breathing of someone managing pain by keeping it at arm's length through concentration. "They took him 3 months ago. The same night the accounts moved." He looked past her at Reyes, then back. Whoever set this up, they needed him gone, and they needed the money moving, and they needed it to look like he'd stolen it and disappeared. Elena stood very still. "Who?" she said. "I don't know all of it. I know a name." Marco's gaze went to Reyes again, longer this time, and something passed across his face. Not quite fear, more like the calculation of a man trying to determine how much disclosure was going to cost him. "I need to talk to her alone." "That's not possible," Reyes said. "Then I'm done talking." The standoff lasted about 4 seconds, which was how long it took Reyes to pull out his phone, send a text, and receive a response. He looked at the screen, then at Marco, then at Elena with an expression that communicated precisely nothing about what he was thinking. 2 minutes, Reyes said. He stepped back to the far end of the corridor, far enough for the appearance of privacy and not an inch further. Marco crossed into her room. Elena pulled the door mostly closed and turned to face him, and he said, very quietly, "Mercer." The name didn't register at first. Then it did. "Adrian Mercer," she said. "He's the one who moved the accounts, used your father's credentials, his access, his history with Vescari. Set it up so that if anyone looked, Vincent looked guilty." Marco shifted his weight, and his face went tight. Your father is being held. I don't know where. I've been trying to find the trail for 2 months, and 3 days ago, someone burned my apartment, and I've been moving ever since." Elena thought about Damian's whiteboard, the auction network, the buyer profiles that cycled in patterns, the particular elegance of the financial architecture she'd spent 2 hours pulling apart, which had felt, even as she was doing it, like something designed not just to obscure but to survive scrutiny. Mercer. She knew the name the way anyone who'd spent time in Chicago's orbit of money and power knew it. Philanthropist, political strategist, the kind of man who got his name on buildings and his photograph in the right company without ever attaching himself to anything that could be traced. Old money and new influence. The kind of untouchable that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with the people law enforcement answered to. "Why come to me?" she said. "Because you're inside," Marco said simply. "And because Vescari is going to find out eventually, and when he does, someone has to be the one to tell him that the man who built his empire is also the man who just tried to burn it down." Elena looked at him. "You know who Mercer is to Damian," she said. "Everybody knows." She opened the door. Reyes was already moving toward them before she could speak. "He needs a doctor," she said, "and he stays on the property." Reyes looked at Marco for a long moment. "Mr. Vescari will want to speak with him," he said. "I know," Elena said. "Set it up for tomorrow. Tonight, he needs a doctor and a bed." Reyes's jaw moved slightly. Then he nodded once and gestured for Marco to follow, and Marco gave Elena a look as he passed that she interpreted as gratitude mixed with the specific anxiety of a man who has just handed a live grenade to someone else and is watching to see what they do with it. She closed the door, stood in the middle of her room, locked it, then stood there another moment, aware that the lock meant nothing, that Reyes had just walked in here with a key card, and that the terms she'd negotiated with such precision in a 40-story office above the rain were considerably more theoretical than she'd allowed herself to believe. She didn't sleep. On. Morning came in gray and flat off the lake, the water the color of old pewter, and Elena was in the kitchen with coffee when Damian came in at 6:45. He was already dressed, jacket on, and he had the contained, purposeful energy of a man who hadn't slept either, but wasn't going to make it anyone else's problem. He stopped when he saw her. "You know," he said, "Marco Teves came to the East Gate last night." "I'm aware." He poured coffee, didn't sit. "He told you about Mercer." It wasn't a question. Elena looked at her cup. "Did you already know?" she said. The pause before he answered was short, but it was there, and she filed it. "I had a suspicion," he said. "Not a certainty. The account movement had Mercer's fingerprints in the architecture, but fingerprints aren't evidence, and Adrian Mercer is untouchable." "Complicated," he said, and the word cost him something that showed briefly in the set of his shoulders before he controlled it back. Elena looked at him. "Reyes said everyone knows what Mercer is to you." Damian's coffee cup went down on the counter with a precision that wasn't quite controlled enough to be casual. "Reyes talks too much," he said. "He didn't say specifics. I'm asking for specifics." "You're not entitled to them." "I'm living in your house," Elena said. "Someone is using your money to make it look like my father is a thief. That same someone apparently has enough access to your inner circle to have orchestrated this without you catching it for 3 months. She kept her voice level. It took effort. "I think I'm entitled to know whether the person behind all of that is someone you'll actually move against." Damian turned to face her fully. He did it slowly, the way you turn when you're buying yourself a second to decide something. "Mercer," he said, "took me in when I was 17 years old, after my father was killed. He funded the first legitimate business front that made everything else possible. He introduced me to the right people, at the right time, in the right rooms." His voice was even, utterly even, in the way that things are even when the person speaking them is pressing down on something with both hands. "He is the reason I exist in the form I currently exist in. And he's been stealing from you, apparently. And before that," Elena said carefully, "he was using your organization to protect himself. Also, apparently. So what are you going to do?" Damian looked at her for a moment that stretched in a way she felt physically, like pressure changing in a room. I'm going to verify, he said. Before I do anything else, I'm going to verify. And if it's true, then we'll have a different conversation. Elena held his gaze. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. He picked up his coffee again, and the motion was deliberate enough that she understood it was a closing gesture. Don't talk to Marco Tevis again without Reyes present. Marco came to me. I know, I'm not blaming you for it. He moved toward the door, then stopped without turning around. How did you know what to say to Reyes about the doctor and keeping Tevis on property? Elena thought about it. Same way I know anything, she said. I figured out what you'd want, and I did it faster than waiting for you to do it yourself. Another pause, shorter than the last one. Finish your coffee, he said, and walked out. The gala was Damian's idea, which meant it wasn't an idea at all. It was an obligation, the kind of obligation that powerful men construct for themselves so that other powerful men have a place to verify that the first powerful man is still powerful. The Vescari Hotel in the Gold Coast had hosted the Acquisitions Gala every November for 11 years, and Elena understood within 20 minutes of being told she was attending that her presence was deliberate, a signal, carefully constructed, that Damian's operations were stable and his household was ordered, and whatever rumors had begun circulating about missing funds and federal attention were not worth the attention of anyone in this room. She was being used as furniture. She told Damian this in the car on the way there. You're being used as context, he said, without looking up from the phone in his hand. What's the difference? Furniture doesn't talk. Then let me stay home. No. The dress they'd given her was navy, expensive, structured in the way that expensive things sometimes were to disguise the fact that they were armor. Elena wore it the way she wore everything that wasn't her own, correctly, without investment. Her hair was up. The bruising around her eye had faded enough that the makeup covered it cleanly. She looked like someone who belonged in this room, which was the only thing she'd been asked to accomplish, and which she found, as they pulled up to the hotel entrance, deeply irritating. The room was 400 people, and the specific temperature of a space where everyone is performing and everyone knows everyone else is performing, and the performance is so complete and so practiced that it becomes its own reality. Elena stood at Damian's side for the first hour and watched the room the way she watched everything, for patterns, for weight distribution, for where the attention clustered and what it was trying to avoid. She'd had 2 glasses of water and was reaching for a third when the senator found her. She didn't know his name. She would learn it later from Reyes, who recited it with the flat effect of a man reading a citation into a record. What she knew at the time was that he was approximately 60 years old, broad-faced, with the ruddy, slightly soft look of a man who'd been athletic once and had been eating the memory of it for a decade. His eyes had the glassy brightness of someone 3 drinks into the evening, and he moved through the crowd with the entitlement of a man who'd never once considered that his movement might be unwelcome. You're new, he said, appearing at her elbow. Elena turned to look at him and said nothing. Damian's. He said it like a category. He always did have a specific type. I'm not his type, Elena said. I'm his associate. The senator smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd decided in advance that he didn't believe her. Of course you are. His hand came out and closed around her wrist. Not hard. Not yet. Just the casual, proprietary grip of someone who hadn't been told no in long enough that the concept had gotten abstract. His thumb pressed directly onto the old burn scar. Elena went very still. Not from pain, though the pressure was wrong, in a specific way that sent something cold running up her spine. From the sudden, total inability to be in this room, this moment, this man's grip, without also being in every other room and moment and grip that lived in the same part of her nervous system that she'd spent 10 years building walls around. She heard herself say very quietly, "Let go of my wrist." "Relax," the senator said. "I just want to let go of my wrist." He didn't. What happened next happened fast. There was a hand, not Elena's, that appeared between them, and it did not touch the senator. It simply interposed itself, and the senator looked up from Elena's wrist to find Damian Vescari, standing close enough that the space between them was functionally 0, and Damian's face was the face of a man who has made a complete internal decision and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up with it. "Senator," Damian said. The grip on Elena's wrist released. She took one step back and one breath and cataloged the damage. Not physical, nothing physical, just the particular residue of being grabbed, which wasn't pain but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the body below the level of language and didn't respond to reasoning. The senator was speaking. Something diplomatic, something that involved the word misunderstanding and the phrase no offense intended, and the particular verbal scrambling of a man recalibrating in real time. Damian listened to all of it with an expression of perfect surgical courtesy, and the exchange lasted approximately 90 seconds. And then the senator was elsewhere in the room with his drink and his ruddy face and his grip that he probably wouldn't remember by morning. Damian turned to Elena. She was already walking. She made it to the corridor off the main ballroom before he caught up with her, and she didn't stop walking, and he fell into step beside her without touching her, which she registered somewhere below conscious thought as significant. "Elena, I'm fine." "You're not walking like someone who's fine." "I'm walking like someone who needs 30 seconds that aren't in that room." She pushed through a door into a side corridor, narrower, quieter, the noise of the gala muffled to a low-frequency hum behind them. She stopped, put her back against the wall, let herself breathe for a moment that she hadn't let herself breathe in the main room. Damian stood in front of her, not close, not the aggressive proximity he used in other contexts, just present, watching her face with an attention that she was beginning to recognize as his version of something she didn't have a clean word for. "You should have let me handle it," she said. "He wasn't letting go." "I would have made him let go." "I know you would have," Damian said. "That's not why I stepped in." Elena looked at him. "Then why?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes went to her wrist, the one the senator had held, and she saw the same thing in his face she'd seen in the mirror of the corridor weeks ago, that raw, unclassifiable thing that wasn't pity and wasn't revulsion. "Someone hurt you," he said. "Before me. Before any of this." Elena's chest went tight. "That's not a conversation we're having," she said. "I'm not asking you to explain it." "Then what are you doing?" "I'm telling you that I noticed," he said, "and that what I almost did to that man in there—" He stopped. His jaw shifted. "I would have done it in front of 400 people, and I wouldn't have cared." The corridor was very quiet. "You don't know me well enough to—" "I know enough," he said. "Damian." His name in her mouth felt strange. She'd used it before, a handful of times, but always as a tool to get his attention, to redirect, never like this, never as just itself. "Whatever you think you know about what happened to me, it doesn't change your position, or mine. We have an arrangement. The arrangement doesn't require me to watch someone." "Stop," she said, sharper than she meant it. He stopped. She took a breath. "I have spent a significant amount of my life managing how people react to the things that happen to me. I'm very good at it. I don't need you to—" She stopped, restarted. "I need you to not make it harder." Silence. "How do I make it harder?" he said, and his voice was different, lower, the control slightly differently applied, like the difference between a locked door and a held-shut one. "By looking at me like that," Elena said. He looked away. It was the fastest she'd ever seen him move to accommodate another person. They stood in the corridor for another minute without speaking. Then Elena pushed off the wall and straightened the line of her dress and said, "We should go back in." "You don't have to." "Someone has to stand next to you and look like everything is stable and ordered," she said. "That's why I'm here." She walked back toward the ballroom door. Behind her, Damian said quietly, "That's not the only reason." She pushed through the door without turning around. It was 3 weeks later that Damian found the medical records. He didn't tell her immediately. She understood that later, piecing the timeline together from things Reyes let slip and from the shift she felt in Damian's behavior. Small things. Things that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent months in close proximity to a man who communicated primarily through precise, calibrated control. He became quieter. He stopped sending her out of rooms when sensitive conversations happened. He stood between her and doors without apparently being aware that he was doing it. She let it build until she couldn't anymore. It was a Tuesday. "Rain again," Chicago in November had only 2 modes, and this was the wet one. Elena was working in the East Wing office, cross-referencing the buyer profiles from the auction network against a database of corporate shell registrations that Damian's tech team had pulled, looking for the overlap she'd suspected since the first night on the whiteboard. She found it at 11:43 in the morning. 64 shell entities, 17 of them tracing through layers of incorporation back to a holding company registered in Luxembourg in 2011. The holding company's registered agent was a law firm. The law firm's primary client, listed in a leaked disclosure document from a regulatory proceeding 4 years ago, was a private trust called the Mercer Family Foundation. Elena sat with that for a long moment. Then she started looking for her father. It took her 40 minutes of moving through the network, carefully, quietly, using access she'd accumulated over weeks in ways that Damian's team had apparently not specifically restricted because they hadn't anticipated she'd know where to look, to find the encrypted partition in Vincent Vale's old account infrastructure. It wasn't financial records. It was medical records. Hers. Elena's hands stopped moving on the keyboard. The documents were time-stamped. 12 years old. 14. The language was clinical, which somehow made it worse. The flat, descriptive vocabulary of hospital intake forms and attending physician notes, fractures and lacerations, and the particular bureaucratic euphemisms that medical professionals had developed for writing about things they didn't want to formally name. Accidentally fell. Consistent with a fall downstairs. Patient declines to specify cause of injury. She read every word. All of it. Every admission. Every discharge. Every note that said one thing in the language of documentation and another thing entirely in the white space between the lines. She was so deep in it that she didn't hear the door. She didn't hear Damian come in. She became aware of him only when she noticed that the room had become very still, in a way that rooms become still when another person's shock fills the available space and crowds out everything else. She looked up. He was standing on the other side of the desk, and he was looking at her screen, and his face was the face of a man who has just seen something that has broken a fundamental assumption he'd been operating on. Not just modified it, not just complicated it, but cracked it cleanly at the base so that everything built on top of it is now in question. "You already knew," she said. His eyes came to her face. "I found them 6 days ago," he said. The number landed like something physical. 6 days, Elena said. "I was trying to—" He stopped. The control was there, but it was different now, applied to something different than she was used to seeing him manage. "I didn't know how to—" 6 days, she said again. "Elena, you read my medical records." Her voice was very quiet, very flat. The kind of flat that wasn't calm, but was the thing that lived on the other side of calm, past the point where the emotional register simply stops having accessible language for what it's doing. "You read everything. You knew for 6 days, and you didn't—" "I didn't know what to say to you." "So you said nothing." "I was trying to find out who," he said. "Before I came to you with it. I wanted to have more than just—" "Stop." She stood up. The chair scraped back, and she was on her feet and moving before she'd made the decision to move, not toward the door, just away from the desk, away from the screen. The need to not be sitting while this was happening overriding everything else. "Don't explain your process to me. Don't." She put her hands on the windowsill and looked out at the gray lake. Her reflection looked back at her from the glass, pale, controlled, hands gripping the sill with the specific whiteness of restrained force. Damian did not follow her to the window. She registered that. "My father," she said. "He had those records." "Yes." "In a hidden partition." "Yes." "Why would he—" She stopped. The answer to the question arrived before she finished asking it, in the particular way that answers to questions you've spent years not asking tend to arrive. All at once, fully formed, with the weight of something that was always true and is only now permitted to be seen. She heard her own breath change. "He was keeping them," she said, "as inventory." The word came from somewhere she didn't intend. It was the right word. She knew it was the right word the way you know something is true, not because you've verified it, but because your entire nervous system has already processed it and is simply waiting for your conscious mind to catch up. Behind her, Damian said nothing, which was the only possible correct response. She stood at the window for a long time. The lake didn't change. The rain came down at an angle off the water, steady, indifferent, the kind of weather that continues regardless of what happens inside the rooms that look out at it. Then she said, "Who?" One word. "I have a name," Damian said. His voice had gone to somewhere she hadn't heard it go before, not cold, not controlled, not the iron flat register he used for business or threat. Something lower, something that sounded like what remained of a voice after everything performative had been stripped out of it. "I need you to understand that when I tell you, it changes things." "Tell me." "It changes everything," he said, "for both of us." "Damian?" She turned from the window. He was still standing where he'd been, across the desk, and his hands were at his sides, and he looked, for the first time since she'd met him in that elevator with blood on her face and a flash drive in her fist, like a man who did not know with certainty what he was going to do next. "Tell me the name," she said. Damian looked at her. "Adrian Mercer," he said. Elena had already suspected. She'd known since Marco Teves appeared at the East Gate. But suspicion and confirmation are not the same country, and she felt the difference between them now as a physical thing, a shift in atmospheric pressure, the moment before the weather breaks. She watched Damian's face as he said the name, watched what it cost him, and understood for the first time what she was actually asking him to do. Because the man who had put cigarette burns on her wrists and broken ribs and damage into her medical records in language too careful to ever admit what it was describing, that man was not a stranger to Damian Vescari. That man was the closest thing Damian had ever had to a father. And the look on Damian's face right now, in this office, with the rain coming down off Lake Michigan and the name hanging between them like smoke, that look was not the look of a man deciding whether to act. It was the look of a man who has already decided and who knows that the decision is going to cost him. The name didn't echo. That was the thing about truly devastating words. They didn't echo, didn't reverberate, didn't do any of the dramatic things that language was supposed to do when it carried sufficient weight. Adrian Mercer. 2 words. They landed in the space between Elena and Damian and then simply stayed there, the way a stone stays at the bottom of still water, visible and immovable, and changing the shape of everything around it by its mere presence. Damian hadn't moved from his position across the desk. Elena hadn't moved from the window. The rain continued its indifferent work against the glass. "How long?" she said. Her voice came out at a register she didn't entirely recognize, not the flat, managed tone she'd spent years perfecting, but something underneath that, something that had apparently survived all the years of management intact and was now speaking without permission. "How long have you known him?" 23 years, Damian said, "since you were 17. "Since I was 17. She looked at him. Really looked. Not the way she usually looked at him, which was strategic, cataloging, the way you look at a landscape you're trying to navigate. This was something else. This was looking for the thing underneath the thing, the crack in the foundation. Because if there was ever a moment to see it, it was now, when his face was doing something he wasn't fully controlling. What she saw was not what she expected. She expected the calculation. The management of competing interests, Mercer on one side, the evidence on the other, the mathematics of loyalty and self-preservation being run in real time. That was what she'd prepared herself for, that particular coldness, the kind she'd encountered so many times in so many forms that she'd developed a nearly clinical immunity to it. What she saw instead was grief, not the performative kind, not the kind that people display because the situation calls for it. The real thing, which was ugly and had no particular shape and made his jaw do something she'd never seen it do before, a slight, involuntary shift that he caught after approximately a second and locked back down. She turned from the window and walked to the desk and sat in the chair she'd vacated and said, "Tell me everything you found." Damian sat. He opened the laptop she'd been working on, closed her financial documents without comment, which she noted, and pulled up a folder she hadn't accessed. The files inside were organized with the kind of precision that came from someone putting controlled effort into something emotionally uncontrolled, the neat labeling of a person managing the only part of the situation they could manage. "The medical records go back to when you were 12, he said. His voice was doing the February sidewalk thing again, the controlled flatness, but underneath it she could hear the effort now in a way she hadn't been able to before the grief showed through. The first admission was a broken wrist, listed as a gymnastics injury. The attending physician's notes include one line, that says, patient presented with older periosteal trauma, inconsistent with mechanism described. It's buried in the middle of the intake documentation. Elena looked at the screen. She knew what the document said. She'd read them herself 40 minutes ago, but she let him tell her because the way he was telling her was itself a form of information. The admissions repeat across 4 years, 12 different hospitals, which is deliberate, she said, so no single physician would have the full picture. Yes. His jaw shifted again. The payment records for those admissions are routed through a series of corporate accounts. 3 of those accounts have ownership structures that trace back through 4 layers of incorporation to Adrian Mercer. Elena heard herself breathe. He paid for my hospital stays, she said. He arranged them, chose the facilities. The records indicate, in language that requires some reading between lines, that the referrals came from a single source. Damian stopped. His hands were flat on the desk, and she could see the deliberateness of their stillness. Elena, your father didn't introduce you to Mercer. It was the other way. She looked up from the screen. Mercer introduced himself to your father, Damian said. The financial records I found in Vincent's encrypted accounts, the payments your father received over those 4 years, they weren't gambling debts being covered. They were structured payments, regular intervals. The structure of them matches what you'd see in a contractor relationship. The room was very, very quiet. Say it clearly, Elena said. Your father was contracted, Damian said, and the word came out with the sound of something being torn along a seam that was never meant to open. He was specifically recruited because he had a daughter the right age, and because he needed money badly enough, and because Mercer had spent considerable time developing a method for identifying men like your father with a precision that— Stop, Elena said. He stopped. She sat with it for a moment. The particular quality of understanding something that your nervous system has already known for years. That's the worst of it, she thought. Not the knowing, but the recognition. The moment where the thing you've been storing in the dark place where you keep what can't be looked at directly gets dragged into ordinary light and turns out to be exactly the shape you always suspected it was. Her father hadn't been weak. He hadn't been desperate and stupid and circumstantially terrible. He'd been recruited, vetted, selected. It was in some way she couldn't fully articulate, worse. How many? She said. Damian's expression shifted. How many others? She said. If he had a method, if he did this systematically. I don't have a full count yet. How many that you know about? A pause. 7. Elena stood up. Not quickly. She was past the quick, reactive movements, past the stage where her body expressed what her mind was processing through urgency. She stood up slowly and walked to the window again and stood with her back to him, and her forehead almost but not quite touching the glass. 7. I want to see his financial records, she said. Mercer's, all of them, everything your team has pulled. Elena, I'm not asking for your permission, she said. I'm telling you what I need in order to be useful to you, which is what I'm here for. She turned around. Her face felt strange, stiff, the muscles doing something unfamiliar. Unless you've decided that the man who built your empire is more valuable than the truth. The look that crossed Damian's face at that, she filed it. Not as a weapon, just as information. I'll have Reyes pull everything, he said. Tonight. Tonight, he confirmed. She nodded once and walked out of the office and down the corridor and up the stairs to her room, and she locked the door and she sat on the floor because the bed felt too soft for what she was holding, and she stayed there until the light coming through the window shifted from gray afternoon to gray evening, and she did not cry, and she did not scream, and she stared at the wall and let the full weight of the last 24 hours settle into her bones like something calcifying. When Reyes knocked at 8 o'clock with a laptop and a key card that gave her access to the financial server, she opened the door and took both without a word and went back to work. 3 days later, she had what she needed. The financial architecture was beautiful in the way that very ugly things are sometimes beautiful. in its completeness, its internal consistency, the elegant, self-reinforcing logic of a system designed by someone who understood not just money, but the psychology of the people whose money he was moving. Mercer hadn't stolen from Damian impulsively. He hadn't opportunistically exploited the relationship when a gap appeared. He had been planning the exit for 5 years. Elena laid it out on the whiteboard in the East Wing office. Not the same whiteboard she'd used the first night, a clean one, pulled from a storage room, and wrote in the shorthand she'd developed over the past weeks that Damian could now read as fluently as she could, and she walked him through it piece by piece while Reyes stood by the door and said nothing, and she watched Damian's face as the architecture revealed itself. His expression did not change. That was worse than if it had. "The Luxembourg holding company is the center of it," she said. "Everything routes through there. The stolen accounts, the shell buyers in the auction network, the offshore distributions. But the holding company also has a second function." She pointed to the far right section of the board. "It's been receiving payments from a different source, not from your operations, from a group of offshore accounts that predate your relationship with Mercer by 6 years." Damian looked at the board. "Who owns those accounts?" "That's what took me 3 days." Elena set down the marker. "The accounts were established by a man named Gavril Costa. He's been dead for 12 years, but before he died, he transferred control of those accounts to a legal trust." She paused. "The trust's designated beneficiary is a private security consulting firm incorporated in Cyprus. That firm has 2 known contracts in the last decade, one with a federal law enforcement agency I can't name because I can only see the payment routing, not the recipient, and one—" She stopped, made herself continue. "One ongoing retainer with the office of a federal prosecutor who has been building a RICO case against the Vescari organization for the last 3 years." The room went absolutely still. Reyes straightened from his position by the door. Damian's eyes came to her face slowly, with the weight of something very heavy moving very carefully. "Mercer has been feeding information to federal prosecutors," he said. "For 3 years," Elena said, "while simultaneously positioning himself to absorb your financial infrastructure when the indictments land. The stolen accounts aren't just about money, they're about control. He moves the accounts. He makes it look like internal corruption, the federal case advances, your organization collapses, and Mercer steps into the vacuum with clean hands and an established financial network that he's spent years building under your cover." Silence. "He built you," Reyes said from the door, "to build a structure he could take." "Yes," Elena said. Damian sat down. It was the first time she had ever seen him simply sit, not strategically, not as a positioning choice, but because his body had made the decision independent of his control. He sat in the chair beside the whiteboard and looked at the floor and said nothing for approximately 30 seconds. Then he said, "My father." Elena looked at him. 12 years ago, Damian said, "Gavril Costa was the man contracted to kill my father." His voice was still flat, still controlled, but there was something happening underneath it that she could feel in the room the way you feel a subsonic frequency. Not hear, feel. "I spent 4 years finding the man who ordered the contract. I never found him." He looked up at the board, at the name written in Elena's handwriting at the center of the financial web. "I was looking for a rival, someone trying to take territory." "It wasn't territorial," Elena said quietly. "No," Damian said. "It was foundational." He stood up. When he turned from the board, his face had changed. Not dramatically, nothing as legible as rage or grief, but something structural had shifted, something load-bearing, and she could see the adjustment happening in real time, the way you can see a building settle when a support column is removed. Everything was still standing. Everything would continue to stand, but nothing was in quite the position it had been in before. "He killed my father," Damian said. "Then he made me trust him. Then he spent 20 years using what I built to construct the mechanism that was going to destroy me." He said it with perfect flatness, the way you recite facts in the aftermath of the thing the facts describe. "And he did it while He stopped. "While you were grateful," Elena said. The word landed. He looked at her. "You were 17 years old, and someone had just murdered your father," she said. "And a man came along who offered you structure and resources, And the thing that feels like family when you've just lost the only family you had. You were grateful. She held his gaze. That's not stupidity. That's what he was counting on. Damian looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I need to move on him now. Before the federal case advances far enough that moving on him becomes moving against. The door opened. Not Reyes's doing. Reyes was still standing at the door, and he'd gone rigid, his hand moving toward his jacket. The door opened from outside and 3 men came in, and they were Damian's men, or had been Damian's men, and the one in front was Dimitri Kazars, who had been Damian's lieutenant for 9 years, and who Elena had met exactly twice, and who now stood in the doorway with a phone in one hand and an expression that carried the specific quality of a man who has decided that the moment of commitment he'd been postponing has arrived. Damian went very still. Dimitri, he said. There's a problem, Dimitri said. His voice was careful. The careful of calculation, not of concern. Federal surveillance team has been outside the property since 6 this morning. We have a window, maybe 2 hours, before they move to formally establish a perimeter. Elena watched Damian's face process this information against the information currently on the whiteboard directly behind him. She watched the moment the processing completed. Dimitri's eyes went to the whiteboard, moved across it with the speed of someone skimming for specific information. Stopped at the center, at the name written in Elena's hand. His expression did not change. Not surprise. Not shock. Not the natural human involuntary response of a man seeing his employer's most protected secret displayed on a whiteboard. Nothing. Elena felt it before she could articulate it. The recognition arriving in the body first, that cold cascade down the spine that preceded conscious understanding the way a shadow precedes a moving object. Dimitri already knew that name. Damian turned to look at the whiteboard, then turned back to Dimitri. The movement was slow and complete and final, the turning of a man who has just arrived at a conclusion he can't unreach. How long? Damian said. Dimitri's jaw tightened. Damian, how long have you been Mercers? The 2 men behind Dimitri shifted weight, not toward their weapons, not yet, not overtly, but the shift was there, the reconfiguration of bodies that are preparing options. Reyes moved from the door in Elena's peripheral vision. She tracked him without looking directly. 4 years, Dimitri said, not apologetic, not ashamed, the voice of a man who has rehearsed this moment long enough that the performance has become something like conviction. He came to me when the RICO investigation started. I had exposure, old exposure, from a job in 2019 that I thought was buried. He offered to make it disappear. And in exchange, Damian said, information, routing, timelines. Dimitri's eyes moved briefly to Elena, assessing, categorizing, determining what she represented in this new configuration. He didn't want you dead. He wanted you controllable. He always wanted you controllable. That's the thing you never understood about him. He never wanted to destroy you. He wanted to own you the way he owned the politicians and the judges, permanently, quietly, without anyone being able to see the leash. And my father, Damian said. Dimitri's face moved, something involuntary. I didn't know about your father until 2 years ago. When I found out, he stopped. By then I was in too far. By then you were comfortable, Damian said. Quiet, absolutely quiet. Damian, don't. One word, the kind of word that functions as a perimeter. Elena watched Damian's hands. She had learned in the months of living in his orbit that his hands were where the truth of his emotional state was most legible. Not his face, which he controlled almost completely, but his hands, which he controlled considerably less. His right hand was at his side, and it was doing something she'd never seen it do before, a micro-movement in the fingers, an almost imperceptible opening and closing, like a reflex trying to become an action. The federal team outside, Elena said. Every head in the room turned to her. Dimitri, she said. Did you call them? The pause before Dimitri answered was less than a second, but it was there. The call was already scheduled, he said. Mercer's timetable. I didn't accelerate it. But you didn't stop it either, she said. I'm here, aren't I? Dimitri's voice had shifted, something defensive entering it for the first time. I came to tell you about the perimeter. I could have. You came because you needed to see which way it was going to fall, Elena said. You've been running both sides long enough that you know the first rule of a collapsing situation is to be visible to the winning party when the collapse completes. She looked at him. You don't know yet which side is going to win. That's why you're here. You're not defecting. You're positioning. The room was very, very quiet. Dimitri looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Damian and said, You brought an accountant into your operation, and now she's reading my psychology. She's right, Damian said. Dimitri's eyes went back to Damian, and something in them shifted. Finally, genuinely shifted. Because Damian's voice had a quality in those two words that Elena had not heard before, and that was apparently new enough to Dimitri that it cut through whatever rehearsed composure he'd arrived with. You have 2 hours, Damian said. Federal perimeter, you said. Approximately. Then we don't have time for this. Damian looked at the two men behind Dimitri. Reyes. Reyes already had his phone out. Put him in the east room, Damian said. Alone. Secure. Nobody goes in or out. Dimitri's composure fractured. Damian, I came here to... You came here to position yourself, Damian said. Elena just told you that, so I'm positioning you first. He looked at Dimitri with the iron-gray attention that Elena had seen him use in other contexts, and which had never failed to produce results. And he said, If what you've given Mercer gives him enough to move on me in the next 2 hours, you'll spend the rest of your life in that room. If what you know helps me move on him first... He paused. Let the pause do what pauses do. Then we can have a different conversation about what 4 years is worth. Dimitri looked at him, looked at Elena, looked at the whiteboard. He went with Reyes. The door closed. Damian stood alone in the office with Elena and the whiteboard and the financial architecture of his own destruction mapped out in her handwriting, and he was silent for a moment that had the quality of something ending, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical weight that moments of this magnitude were supposed to carry, just the plain, unglamorous quality of a thing coming to its conclusion. Then he turned to the whiteboard and picked up the marker she'd set down and wrote a single word in the space below Mercer's name. Tonight. He looked at Elena. I need to ask you something, he said. Ask. The financial network, the shell accounts, the Luxembourg holding company. He kept his eyes on her face. Can you collapse it? Not just trace it. Collapse it. Move the assets out from under him before he can access them. Strip the infrastructure so that when he tries to trigger the endgame, there's nothing there to trigger. Elena looked at the board, at the web she'd spent 3 days mapping. It would take 8 hours, she said. Maybe 10. We have 2. Then I need to start immediately, she said. And I need you to keep the federal team outside from executing any warrants for the next 2 hours while I work. I can do that. And I need you to understand, she said, that what I'm about to do is not legal. He looked at her. You told me in the beginning, she said. You told me that was negotiable, and I told you it wasn't. I remember. I'm negotiating now, Elena said. Damian Vescari looked at her for a long moment, and something moved across his face. Complex, multi-layered, the expression of a man revising a fundamental understanding in real time. And then he said, I know. Elena pulled the laptop toward her and opened the first account interface and began to work. And behind her, Damian was already on the phone with someone whose voice she couldn't hear. And outside the property, the federal surveillance team sat in their vehicles and watched the driveway and knew nothing yet of what was happening inside these walls. And somewhere in the city, Adrian Mercer was looking at a clock and waiting for a sequence of events to begin that he had spent 5 years engineering toward this specific night. He did not know that inside the machine he'd built so carefully, with such patience, across so many years, a 24-year-old woman with burn scars on her wrists and a talent for finding where systems, she worked the way she'd always worked under pressure, without ceremony, without the performance of urgency, just the absolute compression of attention into the task in front of her, everything peripheral becoming irrelevant, the room narrowing to the screen and the numbers and the architecture she'd spent 3 days mapping and was now going to spend 2 hours dismantling from the inside. The first account was the Luxembourg holding company. She went in through a secondary administrative portal that Mercer's team had set up for routine maintenance and apparently never considered a vulnerability, which told her something about how Mercer thought, which was that he trusted the elegance of his own systems more than was warranted. Elegant systems had elegant failure points. You just had to find the aesthetic. 40 minutes in, she'd moved 63% of the primary assets into a set of accounts that existed in a regulatory gray zone she'd identified 3 days ago and noted without knowing she'd need it this quickly. The accounts were real, legitimately registered, and belonged to a series of charitable trusts that Mercer himself had established years ago as part of his philanthropic cover. The particular irony of using his own legitimacy infrastructure against him was not lost on her, but she filed it for later because there was no time for irony right now. Damian came back into the office at the 90-minute mark. "Federal team is still holding," he said. He was looking at his phone, moving without stopping, a quality of contained kinetic energy she'd never felt from him at this intensity. Like something that had been compressed for a long time had reached the limit of what compression could contain. "I have 20 minutes, maybe less, before the U.S. Attorney's office sends the order to advance regardless of what our people on the outside are doing. I need 40. You have 20. Then I need you to stop telling me how long I have and let me work." He stopped, looked at her screen, looked at her face. "What do you need?" he said. "The Cyprus firm," she said without looking up. "The security consulting company that holds the retainer with the federal prosecutor. I need someone on your team who can access their server infrastructure from outside the financial network. I can see the account structures, but I can't get to the operational files from here, and if there's documentation of what Mercer gave them, documentation with dates and specifics, that's leverage. That's the thing that makes this survivable beyond tonight." Damian had his phone up before she finished the sentence. She heard him speaking to someone, not Reyes, a different voice, younger, faster. And she went back to the screen and kept working. At the 105-minute mark, her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She answered it on speaker without stopping typing. "The Cyprus files," said the young, fast voice from Damian's call. "I've got a directory, 47 folders." "What am I looking for?" "Folder names with dates in the last 18 months, Elena said. "Anything that looks like meeting notes or communication logs. Specifically looking for a name, Adrian Mercer, paired with any reference to case numbers or investigation timelines. I've got 3 folders with date-formatted names. Open the most recent one." A pause. Keys clicking at the other end. "There's a document," the voice said. "Looks like a summary memo. It's got a case number at the top, Northern District, RICO filing, and a date." Another pause. "Elena, the date on this memo is 4 days from now." She stopped typing. "Read me the relevant section," she said. "It says, quote, asset freeze orders to be executed simultaneously with property warrants, coordinated with parallel action by cooperative party to ensure transfer of financial controls prior to indictment announcement." Cooperative party is named as a MF Holdings, which I'm looking at right now, and it's the Luxembourg company. Mercer's own holding company, positioned to absorb the assets the moment the freeze orders hit and the Vescari accounts locked. He wasn't going to steal the money, Elena said, mostly to herself. He was going to inherit it, legally, through the chaos of the federal action. She looked up. Damian was standing in the middle of the room, and his face had done the thing again. The structural shift, the load-bearing adjustment, but faster this time, and with something underneath it that she recognized from her own experience of certain specific moments, which was the sensation of a plan becoming irrelevant because the situation had just changed its fundamental shape. "He's not waiting for us to move," Damian said. "He was never going to wait," Elena said. "The timetable was always his. We've been operating like we had options, and we don't. We have one option, and it requires doing something in the next..." She checked the time. 14 minutes that I genuinely cannot do from here. Damian looked at her. "What do you need?" he said again. The same words as before, different weight. "I need to be in the same room as Mercer's primary server," she said. "Physical access. The Luxembourg accounts have a secondary authentication that's biometric. I've been routing around it, but the routing takes time I don't have. If I can get to the hardware, I can bypass the biometric entirely and complete the transfer. She held his gaze. Where does he keep his primary server infrastructure? A silence that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. The Opera House, Damian said. The Mercer Opera House sat on the lakefront south of the Gold Coast like something left over from a different century. Stone facade, arched windows, the name carved above the entrance in letters deep enough to cast their own shadows. Adrian Mercer had donated the building to the city 20 years ago and then funded its renovation so comprehensively that the city had given him a permanent private floor and the kind of operational autonomy that money bought when it was given in public and with sufficient visibility. The charity gala was already in progress when they arrived. 400 people inside. Chicago's elite performing their annual ritual of visible generosity, while waitstaff moved through the crowd with champagne and the auction catalog for the evening, sat on every table with a starting bid on a Mercer Foundation scholarship fund that had been, Elena now knew, a money laundering vehicle for 11 years. Damian stopped the car 1 block south. "You're not going in the front," he said. "I know." "Reyes will take you through the loading dock entrance. There's a service corridor that runs along the east wall. It connects to the technical infrastructure room on the sublevel." He turned to look at her. His face in the dark of the car was stripped of most of its usual architecture, just the planes of it, the jaw, the iron-colored eyes. "The server room will be locked. There'll be at least one of Mercer's security people on that floor." "I'll manage the lock," Elena said. "What about the security?" A pause. "I'll manage the security," Damian said. She looked at him. "You're going in the front." "I have an invitation," he said. "I've attended this gala for 8 years. Mercer expects me here. My absence would tell him something's wrong faster than my presence will. And when he sees you—" "He'll perform," Damian said. "He's been performing for 23 years. He'll perform tonight." Something crossed his face, there and gone. "And while he's performing, I need you to finish what you started in the East Wing. And if I can't finish in time?" "Then we do this differently," he said, "and differently means worse." Elena opened the car door. The November air hit her immediately, cold off the lake, with the smell of rain coming that hadn't started yet. She was still wearing the clothes she'd been in when this started, not the gala dress, just her own clothes, dark enough and plain enough to not attract attention in a service corridor. She stopped with 1 foot out of the car. "Damian," she said. "Go," he said. "If this goes wrong, it won't." "But if it does," she said. He looked at her for a moment that had the quality of something being committed to, not spoken, not performed, just decided, quietly, in the space between 2 people in a dark car outside a building where everything was about to become irreversible. "It won't," he said again, differently than the first time. She got out of the car. Basset. The loading dock smelled like cigarette smoke and old cardboard, and the particular industrial cold of spaces that existed to be functional rather than experienced. Reyes was already there, having come separately, and he moved her through the dock entrance and into the service corridor with the economy of someone who had navigated hostile architecture before and found the process unremarkable. The corridor ran exactly where Damian had said it would, along the east wall, low ceiling, pipes overhead, lighting that was adequate and nothing more. Their footsteps were quiet on the concrete. Elena counted doors as they passed them, 3 on the left, 2 on the right. The 4th on the left was the one. Reyes stopped at it, looked at the electronic lock. Elena looked at it for approximately 4 seconds, then took from her jacket pocket the secondary keycard she'd had the tech team clone 2 hours ago from the access profile she'd found in Mercer's Cypress files. His own credentials, lifted from his own operational documentation, used against his own door. The lock clicked open. Reyes put his hand on her arm before she went in. She turned. 7 minutes, he said. His voice was the same temperature it always was, which tonight she found oddly stabilizing. "That's what we can hold upstairs, 7 minutes before someone notices something." "I need 10, she said. Reyes's jaw moved. 8. 9, and I don't argue with you again for a month. Something shifted in his face that wasn't quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. 8.5, he said, and I'm timing it. She went in. The server room was cooler than the corridor. the particular refrigerated air of a space that housed equipment that generated heat and needed its temperature managed. The servers were in 2 racks along the far wall, black towers humming with the low, continuous sound of something that never slept. A monitor glowed on a desk to the left, displaying a network status screen with a blinking cursor that indicated the system was waiting for the next authorized input. Elena sat at the desk, pulled the laptop from the bag Reyes had carried and connected to the local network through a cable port in the back of the nearest rack. The connection established in 4 seconds. The authentication prompt appeared. She didn't use Mercer's credentials this time. She used the administrative backdoor she'd identified in the Luxembourg network architecture 3 days ago. The maintenance portal, the elegant failure point of an elegant system. And she was inside in under 90 seconds. The assets were there. All of them. The full weight of what Mercer had spent 5 years building, sitting in digital accounts behind a biometric lock that she could see now from the inside, from the administrative level, and which resolved itself from this angle into something considerably simpler than it had appeared from outside. She started the transfer sequence. The progress bar appeared. 30%. 40%. Upstairs she could hear, faintly, through the ceiling and the floors, conducted through the building's structure, the sound of 400 people attending a charity gala. Glasses touching, a string ensemble, the particular acoustic quality of a room full of money performing ease. 60%. Her phone buzzed. Reyes, problem. Upstairs, keep working. She kept working. 70. The door to the server room opened. Not Reyes. A man she didn't know. 30s, security jacket, the build of someone who spent time in the gym because his job required it and not because he enjoyed it. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, and his hand went toward his jacket before his brain had fully processed what he was seeing. Stop, Elena said, without looking away from the screen. I'm almost done, and if you interrupt this transfer sequence, we both lose something we don't want to lose. The man's hand paused. Who are you? He said. Someone who has been inside your employer's financial network for the last 3 hours, Elena said. Which means I know things about your employer that would make your current employment situation significantly less appealing if you were aware of them. 80%. I also know that the federal team that's been outside the Vescari property tonight has a sister team 2 blocks from this building, and that the warrant they're executing in approximately 6 minutes covers this building and everything in it. She looked up at him. Including anyone inside it who is actively obstructing the transfer of evidence-connected assets. The man looked at her, looked at the screen, looked at the connection cable running from the rack to her laptop. You're moving money, he said. I'm moving evidence, she said, out of reach of the man who is currently upstairs accepting a humanitarian award and who will, in approximately 3 years, be convicted of crimes that would require significantly more than 1 evening to list. 90%. You can stop me, in which case you're complicit, or you can step out of this room and not have been here. A long, loud silence. The man stepped out of the room. The door closed. 100%. Elena disconnected the cable, closed the laptop, and sat for exactly 2 seconds doing nothing, because the 2 seconds were necessary and she was going to allow them. Then she was moving. The corridor, the loading dock, up. Reyes met her at the 2nd floor landing, and his face was doing something that faces didn't usually do, which was multiple things simultaneously. Relief, intention, and the specific alertness of someone managing a situation that had changed faster than expected. He knows, Reyes said. Mercer. He made Damian in the first 10 minutes. Whatever performance he was going to give, he cut it. He's been moving toward the back exit for the last 4 minutes. Reyes was already moving as he spoke, and Elena moved with him, up the stairs, through a door, into the corridor that ran behind the main floor of the opera house. Damian went after him. Where? Backstage. The building has tunnels, access corridors underneath the stage for equipment movement. Mercer's security cleared the route. He paused at a junction in the corridor. His hand came out and stopped her moving forward. Listened. This way. The backstage area was a different world from the gala. Raw, functional, the organized chaos of theatrical infrastructure that existed to produce an illusion of elegance from a distance. Ropes and counterweights, equipment cases stacked along the walls, the smell of old wood and something electrical. The noise of the gala muffled now to a frequency she felt more than heard. They went down. The stairs to the tunnel level were wooden, steep, the kind of stairs that had been built for utility and maintained for necessity. The tunnel itself was low-ceilinged and ran perpendicular to the stage above, lit by a string of industrial bulbs that threw harsh shadows in the wrong directions and made everything look slightly wrong, slightly tilted. Elena heard them before she saw them. Not words. Footsteps. 2 sets. Uneven. One faster than the other. The acoustic quality of a pursuit in an enclosed space. Then a sound that wasn't a footstep, something harder, shorter, the sound of a body making contact with a surface, and then a voice. Mercer's voice. She rounded the corner of the tunnel and stopped. The space opened slightly here. A junction point, 4 tunnel branches meeting, the ceiling fractionally higher. Adrian Mercer was pressed against the far wall with Damian's forearm across his chest and Damian's gun at his temple, and he was 64 years old and silver-haired and wearing a tuxedo that had cost more than most people's monthly income, and he was completely, entirely unafraid. That was the first thing Elena registered. Not bravado. Not the performance of composure. Actual absence of fear, which was different and considerably worse. The composure of a man who had been navigating situations of extreme consequence for so long that the fear response had simply ceased to operate. "Damian," Mercer said, his voice at ordinary conversational volume in the tunnel. "You're making a scene." "There's no one here to make a scene for," Damian said. "There will be." Mercer's eyes moved past Damian's shoulder and found Elena, and the quality of attention he aimed at her made her skin do something involuntary. "Your accountant. She's been busy tonight." "She's done," Damian said. "The accounts are moved. Your endgame doesn't have a mechanism anymore." Mercer considered this for a moment with the expression of someone receiving information about a chess match they've already decided the outcome of. "There are other mechanisms," he said. "Not tonight, there aren't." "No," Mercer agreed. "Not tonight." He looked at Damian with something that Elena could only describe as affection, which was the most disturbing thing she'd seen in a sequence of disturbing things. "You did well, Damian. You always did well. That was never the question." "Stop," Damian said. "The question was always whether you'd figure it out before the timing made it irrelevant." Mercer tilted his head slightly, or as much as the forearm across his chest permitted. "You're 48 hours too late. The federal case doesn't require the financial network anymore. It's been building independently for 2 years. The network was the insurance policy, the exit strategy." He looked at Elena again. "Your girl moved the assets. Good. It demonstrates intent. It demonstrates consciousness of guilt. It demonstrates that the Vescari organization, when faced with imminent legal action, moved to obstruct and conceal." He paused. "I didn't need the money, Damian. I needed the evidence of the attempt." The tunnel went very quiet. Elena's mind ran the sequence before she could stop it. The transfer she'd just completed, the accounts she'd moved, the federal surveillance team outside, the warrant that was 4 minutes from execution according to what she'd told Mercer's security man. And she felt the architecture of the night reconfigure itself around a new load-bearing truth. "We moved the assets," she said. Her voice came out steady. She didn't know how. "Into accounts that document Mercer's own financial structure. The transfer records show the origin point and the destination. His accounts, his infrastructure, his holding company receiving the assets." She watched Mercer's face. "You needed evidence of concealment. You got evidence of Mercer Family Foundation absorbing the Vescari assets in the 48 hours before a federal indictment. That's not obstruction on Damian's part." She paused. "That's you executing the theft in real time." Something moved in Mercer's face. The first thing that had moved there since she'd come around the corner. "The administrative access I used to make the transfers," she continued, "was your administrative access. Your credentials, your maintenance portal, your authentication, routed through your Cyprus firm's server infrastructure, which I accessed tonight from a machine in your own building." She took one step forward, just one. "Every transaction record from the last 3 hours has your fingerprints on it. Literally." The biometric authentication logs will show that the person who authorized those transfers was you. The tunnel was completely silent. Above them, muffled through the stage floor and whatever was between them and the gala, the string ensemble played something Elena didn't recognize. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. "Clever girl," he said, and his voice had changed. Not much, not dramatically, but the absence of fear quality had developed a hairline fracture. Something beneath it that she could see now because she knew what to look for, the same way she'd learned to see the things behind people's eyes when they were working to hide them. "Where is my father?" she said. The fracture widened slightly. "Elena's," Damian said. Where is he?" she said again, not louder, harder. Mercer looked at her with the hairline fracture becoming something more visible, and she watched him calculate. The same calculation she'd seen in Dimitri's face, the assessment of which direction the situation was falling, the positioning, and she watched him decide something. "Warehouse District," he said, "south of Chinatown. There's a storage facility on West 34th. The unit number is 7, painted on the outside of the building, not on the unit itself." He said it with the evenness of a man trading information for something he hadn't yet specified. "He's alive. He's been treated adequately." "Treated adequately," Elena repeated. "Kept secure," Mercer said. Above them, the string ensemble stopped. In the silence, Elena could hear footsteps, multiple sets, heavy, purposeful, moving through the backstage area above them and toward the tunnel stairs. And she knew from the quality of them that they were not Mercer's people, and they were not running away from something. "Federal team," Reyes said from behind her, and his voice had a new quality she'd never heard from him before, something raw underneath the flat affect. "They've entered the building." Damian's arm didn't move from Mercer's chest. His gun didn't move from Mercer's temple. His eyes went to Elena with a question in them that she read clearly, the question being whether the play she'd set up was going to hold, whether the evidence architecture she'd built in 3 hours in a server room with 8.5 minutes of runway was strong enough to do what she'd said it would do. She looked at him. Then she looked at Mercer. Mercer looked back at her with the fracture in his composure fully visible now, and she saw something in his eyes she had never expected to see there, the first genuine emotion she'd observed in him since she came around the corner of the tunnel. And it was not fear of the federal agents above them, and it was not fear of Damian's gun, and it was something she needed a moment to name before she recognized it as the particular, specific fear of a man who has just understood that the person looking at him has beaten him. Not matched him, not survived him, beaten him. She was 24 years old with burn scars on her wrists and blood under her fingernails from the parking garage months ago that she sometimes still felt when the light was wrong. And she had walked into his financial architecture with nothing but 3 days and a whiteboard, and she had turned it inside out and used it as a weapon, and the evidence was filed and the accounts were moved and her fingerprints were nowhere on any of it while his were. The federal agents came down the tunnel stairs in a formation that left no interpretive ambiguity about their intent, and the first one around the corner stopped when he saw Damian's gun pressed to Mercer's temple, and the 4 behind him stopped too. And for approximately 3 seconds, the tunnel held a configuration of bodies and weapons and competing authorities that had no clean resolution. Then Elena stepped forward. She held up the laptop, not as a shield, as a document. "My name is Elena Vale," she said, and her voice carried in the tunnel with a clarity that surprised her, bouncing off the low ceiling and the stone walls and coming back to her slightly altered, slightly more certain than she felt. "I have been operating as an embedded financial analyst within the Vescari organization under a protection arrangement. Over the last 72 hours, I have compiled and transferred to a secure filing location a complete record of financial transactions linking Adrian Mercer." She did not look at Mercer when she said his name. "To a series of federal crimes, including conspiracy, obstruction, and the directed use of criminal infrastructure to subvert a federal investigation." She paused. "The transfer was completed 18 minutes ago. The receiving location is the Northern District U.S. Attorney's Office, case number—" She read the number from the document on her screen, the one she'd photographed off the Cypress folder. "The filing is time-stamped. The authentication records are attached." The lead agent looked at her, then at Damian, then at Mercer. Mercer's composure had completed its fracture. What was visible now underneath it was not panic. He was too old and too practiced for panic. But something more fundamental. The expression of a man watching a building he designed collapse in a sequence he did not engineer. "Sir," the lead agent said, and it took Elena a moment to understand he was addressing Mercer. "I need you to step away from the wall." "He has a warrant," Damian said. "Sir," the agent said again, to Damian this time. "Lower your weapon." A long moment. The tunnel hummed with its industrial lights and its low ceiling and the weight of everything that had led to this specific configuration of people in this specific underground space. Damian lowered the gun. He stepped back from Mercer. He did it deliberately, precisely, with the controlled quality of a man completing a movement he'd decided on before he began it. And when he stepped back, he turned slightly so that he was standing beside Elena rather than across from her, and that positioning was not accidental, and she registered it in the part of her chest that had been doing something irregular since the car outside. The agents moved to Mercer. The old man looked at Damian as they took his arms. Not at Elena. At Damian. And the look on his face was the most human thing Elena had seen on it all night. Not the absence of fear, not the performance of composure, not the calculation she'd watched him run since she came around the tunnel corner. Just a man looking at someone he had known for 23 years, with something in his eyes that was the wreckage of whatever that 23 years had meant to him, which apparently was more than Elena had allowed for, which apparently was enough to show on his face when everything else had been stripped away. Damian looked back. His face was unreadable, which was its own kind of answer. They took Mercer up the stairs. The other agents took positions in the tunnel, and one of them came to Elena and asked her to accompany him, and she said yes. And as she moved past Damian, he put one hand briefly, 1 second, maybe less, on her wrist, the inside of her wrist, where the scars were. The touch was barely there, barely qualified as physical contact. She stopped, just for a second. He didn't say anything. She moved on. The next 6 hours happened in rooms that smelled like government-issue coffee, and the specific institutional fatigue of spaces where people came to give accounts of things they had done and things that had been done to them. Elena sat across from 2 federal agents and a woman who introduced herself as an assistant U.S. attorney and told them everything in the order it happened, precisely and without editorializing. And when they asked questions, she answered them. And when they asked questions she couldn't answer, she said so, and at no point in the 6 hours did she cry or raise her voice or perform any of the things people sometimes performed in rooms like this to communicate the weight of what they were conveying. The weight, she had found, conveyed itself. At 4 a.m, the assistant U.S. attorney left the room for 20 minutes and came back and set a document on the table in front of Elena and said that given the nature and scope of the evidence she'd provided, given the circumstances of her involvement, and given the specific documentation of how that involvement began, she slid a copy of the parking garage security footage across the table, which Elena hadn't known they had. The office was prepared to offer a cooperation agreement that would formalize her status as a material witness and provide immunity from prosecution for any activity conducted during the period of her arrangement with the Vescari organization. Elena looked at the document. "What about Damian Vescari, Bukan?" she said. The assistant U.S. attorney looked at her with the expression of someone who had anticipated this question and prepared for it in 2 different ways, depending on what preceded it. "That's a separate matter," she said. "His cooperation," Elena said. "The information he's provided, the access his network gave to Mercer's operations, what weight does that carry?" "Ms. Vale." "I'm asking a direct question," Elena said. "I've been answering direct questions for 6 hours. I'd like one answered back." The assistant U.S. attorney was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Vescari's situation is complicated by the nature of his organization's activities, which substantially predate and exist independently of his involvement in exposing Mercer's crimes. The cooperation is weighted. It matters. But it doesn't erase." "It doesn't erase," Elena repeated. "No." Elena looked at the document for another moment. Then she picked up the pen they'd left beside it and signed where indicated and slid it back across the table. "My father," she said. "West 34th, Warehouse District. Unit marked with a 7 on the building exterior." The assistant U.S. attorney wrote it down. Cool. They found Vincent Vale at 6:47 in the morning. Elena was in a government vehicle outside the warehouse when they brought him out, and she sat in the back seat and watched through the window as her father was helped across the concrete of the loading dock by two federal agents. And she observed him with the specific quality of attention you give to something you've been both dreading and requiring for a very long time. He was thinner. That was the first thing. The 3 months of whatever Mercer's people had defined as adequate treatment had taken 15 pounds off him and replaced it with something older, something that wasn't just physical. He moved like a man who had spent time understanding the distance between who he believed he was and who the evidence indicated he had been, and that understanding had made itself legible in his posture in a way that couldn't be undone by food or sleep or the removal of whatever room they'd kept him in. He saw her through the window. He stopped moving. Elena got out of the car. They stood on the concrete of the loading dock in the early morning gray of a Chicago November, with the lake somewhere behind the warehouse blocks, making its indifferent presence felt in the cold and the smell of the air. And Vincent Vale looked at his daughter, and his daughter looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment that had the quality of something enormous trying to fit itself into an ordinary space. "Elena," he said. His voice was wrecked. 3 months, and something else had done that to it. "I know," she said. She meant it as a complete sentence, meant it to cover the territory of what they were both standing in front of: the medical records, the bank transfers, the 4 years of payments, the 11 years before that of a father who had done the specific thing that fathers existed in opposition to doing, and who had done it for money, and who had done it with enough deliberate arrangement that the word accident was not available to either of them as a resting point. "I know," she said again, "and I'm not going to—" She stopped, started over. "There are things I need from you. I need you to talk to the federal attorney. I need you to tell them everything that you haven't told them yet, which I assume is most of it. I need you to do that completely and without managing what you disclose based on how it reflects on you." She looked at him. "Can you do that?" Vincent Vale looked at her. His eyes had the glassy, fractured quality of a man who had been in a room by himself for 3 months with nothing to look at but the arithmetic of his own choices. "Yes," he said. "Then do that," Elena said. "And then we'll talk, you and I. Not today, not soon, but eventually." She held his gaze. "I'm not forgiving you. I want you to hear that clearly. I don't know if I'm capable of it, and I'm not going to tell you I'm going to try, because I don't lie to people anymore." A breath. "But I'm not done with you either, because you're the only person who can answer some of the questions I still have, and I've learned that some questions need answers more than they need the person to disappear." Vincent Vale nodded. It was the nod of a man receiving something he hadn't earned and knowing it and not making the mistake of pretending otherwise. The federal agents took him to a different vehicle. Elena got back in hers. She sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap and the gray Chicago morning pressing at the windows, and she allowed herself approximately 90 seconds of nothing. No analysis, no cataloging, no reading of the situation for its tactical implications. Just the raw, textureless sensation of being a person who had survived a specific set of things and was still, despite considerable evidence that this outcome was not guaranteed, breathing. Then she took out her phone and made a call. Carla answered on the third ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she'd been watching the news, because the gala story had apparently broken at 4 in the morning and was already everywhere. "Elena," Carla said. "I'm alive," Elena said. "I can see that. It's all over." "Don't tell me what's on the news," Elena said. "I don't want to know what the news version is yet. I just wanted to call." A pause. Then, from Carla, something that was not words. Just the sound of a person who had been afraid for someone and was now processing the removal of that fear in real time. "Okay," Carla said. "Okay, are you—" "Not yet," Elena said, "but I will be." She hung up, looked out the window. The warehouse district was coming awake in the way industrial areas did, slowly, without ceremony, forklifts and delivery trucks, and the ordinary mechanical business of a city that continued its operations regardless of what had happened in an opera house tunnel at midnight. She asked the driver to take her to the lake. Reyes was already there. She didn't know how he'd known to come to the lakefront access point north of the city, the one near the estate. No one had told her that was where she was going until she said it to the driver. But Reyes was there when the vehicle pulled up, standing on the concrete path above the water with his hands in his jacket pockets, and his face set in its usual configuration of having already accounted for the present situation several moves in advance. He looked at her when she got out. "Damian," she said. "30 minutes behind you," Reyes said. "They held him longer. But they let him go." For now, Reyes looked at the lake. The water was dark and flat in the early morning, the sky just beginning to do something lighter at the horizon without committing to it yet. The cooperation agreement, the Mercer evidence, the witness testimony from 3 of Mercer's own people who are moving very fast to not be the last ones talking. He paused. "It's not clean. It won't be clean for a long time. There are things that can't be unwound by cooperation." He looked back at her. "But he's out. And the federal case is pointed somewhere other than him." Elena nodded. "You should know," Reyes said, and his voice had something in it she'd never heard there before, something that required him to recalibrate mid-sentence, that what you did tonight, the server room, the evidence architecture, the authentication records, that's not something that most people could have done in 8.5 minutes with federal agents 4 minutes out. 8.5 was your number, Elena said. I needed 9. Reyes made the not-quite-smile expression. They stood at the lakefront while the city woke up around them, and Elena looked at the water and thought about nothing specific, which was a luxury she hadn't permitted herself in months, and found that nothing specific felt enormous and quiet and not entirely uncomfortable. She heard the car before she saw it. Damian got out alone. He'd changed somewhere between the opera house and here. The tuxedo was gone, plain clothes now, dark jacket, and he moved across the concrete toward the lakefront path with the unhurried quality of a man who had reached the end of a long sequence of movement and was now deciding what the next sequence looked like. Reyes moved away without being asked. He walked back toward the parking area with the tact of someone who had spent years reading rooms and exiting them at precisely the right moment. Damian stopped beside Elena. They looked at the lake. "They held you," she said. "They had questions. About me, among other things." She looked at him. He was looking at the water, and his profile in the early morning gray had the quality she'd noticed the first time she'd really looked at him. The jaw that had been broken and healed slightly wrong, the controlled set of the shoulders, the thing that should have read as damage and instead read as deliberate. She'd spent months reading that profile for information and was only now, standing at the edge of the lake in the aftermath of everything, allowing herself to notice that the reading had at some point stopped being purely strategic. She didn't do anything about that noticing. She just noted it and let it sit. "The estate," she said. "The syndicate, what's left?" "Some," he said. "Mercer spent 5 years trying to dismantle it and didn't finish. What he managed to expose is gone. What he couldn't get to," he paused, "is probably enough to be a different kind of problem, eventually. But not today. And you." He turned to look at her. The iron-colored eyes had something in them that she'd been seeing more of over the past months, something that emerged when his control wasn't entirely covering the territory underneath it. "I arranged documents," he said. "Passports. An account and a name that doesn't connect to anything." He said it with the same precision he used for everything, but underneath it she could hear the effort of saying the next part. "For you. They've been ready for 2 weeks." Elena looked at him. 2 weeks, she said. "I wanted you to have them regardless of how tonight went," he said. "If it went wrong, you'd need them. If it went right—" He stopped. "You'd still have the option." "The option to leave. The option to be somewhere clean," he said. "Somewhere none of this follows you." Elena was quiet for a moment. The lake moved. Somewhere behind them, the city was making its morning sounds. The layered noise of traffic and industry, and the particular acoustic signature of 3 million people beginning another day without any awareness of what had happened in certain underground corridors while they slept. The sun was not yet above the horizon, but the sky was committed to lighter now, the gray shifting through its gradients toward something that wasn't quite dawn yet, but had made its decision to become it. "You think this follows me," she said. I think everything follows everyone, Damian said. I think the question is what kind of distance you can put between yourself and what follows you. And you, she said, what distance are you putting between yourself and what follows you? He was quiet. The documents are for one person, she said. Yes. You made them for me and not for yourself. I have other arrangements, he said. That's not what I asked. He turned back to the lake. His jaw did the thing, the slight involuntary shift that he caught after a second and locked back down. But she could see it now clearly, could see the catching of it as well as the thing being caught. No, he said. I didn't make them for myself. Elena turned to face him fully. He kept his eyes on the water for a moment longer, and she watched the side of his face, and she thought about the elevator, the rain hammering the glass and blood running down her jaw, and the flash drive cutting into her palm. And she thought about the whiteboard in the East Wing, and the corridor after the gala, and the morning in the kitchen where he'd said the name Mercer for the first time and she'd read the grief in his shoulders before he controlled it back. She thought about 100 small moments that she'd cataloged at the time as tactical information and was only now, standing here, understanding had been something else being filed under the wrong category. Damian, she said. He turned. I'm not going anywhere, she said. His expression did what it did. The controlled surface, the thing underneath it, the almost imperceptible adjustment of a face that had spent decades managing what it disclosed. You should, he said. I know, she said. I'm not. Elena, I know what I'm choosing, she said. I've known what I was choosing for longer than I let myself admit, which is a habit I'm working on. She held his gaze. I'm not confused about what you are. I'm not confused about what this is. I've read your financial records and watched you put a gun to a man's head, and I've seen what you're willing to do and what it costs you, and I'm standing here choosing it anyway, which makes me either the most self-aware person you've met or the most damaged. She paused. I think it might be both. Damian looked at her for a long time. The kind of looking that she had learned over months was his version of something that other people expressed differently. The 3 years, he said. The agreement? We're past the agreement, she said. You're 24 years old. I'm aware of my age. I've done things. I know what you've done, she said. I built a spreadsheet of it. Something happened in his face. The precursor to something, the shift in pressure before the weather breaks, and then, just for a second, there and gone, the thing itself, which was not the performance of warmth or the performance of anything, just an actual human expression on the face of a man who had spent so long managing what he showed that the genuine article had become rare enough to be striking. He put his hand on the side of her face. She didn't flinch. That was the thing she noticed, that her nervous system, which had its own long and complicated history with hands near her face, didn't read this one as a threat. It read it as what it was, which was a person making contact with another person in the specific way that meant something without words. She put her hand over his. They stood like that at the edge of the lake while the light continued its slow declaration of morning, the water dark below them and the sky brightening above in gradients of gray and pale, and the first suggestion of color at the horizon, and Chicago moved through the beginning of an ordinary day around them, and neither of them spoke because the things that needed to be said had been said in other moments and other rooms and across months of proximity that had meant more than either of them had intended when they started. Reyes was somewhere behind them. The documents with Elena's new name were somewhere in Damian's jacket. The federal case was moving in its direction and would continue moving regardless of this moment at this lakefront. The Mercer Empire was dismantled. The financial records were filed. Dmitry Kazaris was in a room somewhere giving testimony that would take days to complete. Vincent Vale was in a different room giving a different account of the same years from a different angle. The Opera House was probably still burning, or had burned, or was smoke now above the lakefront. She hadn't confirmed it and didn't need to. Adrian Mercer was in federal custody, and he would stay there, and he would not emerge from it in any form that could reach her. And she knew this not as hope, but as the output of an 8.5-minute calculation she'd run in a server room with a cable port and a back door and the elegant failure point of an elegant system. She had made him use his own hands to do it. She had spent 24 years surviving men who believed that the damage they did was permanent. That what they burned stayed burned, that what they broke stayed broken, that the girl crying behind the locked bathroom door of a hotel room would stay in that room forever, would carry that room with her wherever she went, would never stop being small enough to lock inside it. She was still carrying the room. She understood that. She was not under the illusion that what had happened in the last 24 hours had removed it or replaced it or transformed it into something she could set down. The burn scars were still on her wrists. The medical record still existed, would always exist, in the flat clinical language of what had been done to her and what had been listed as accident. She would still wake up sometimes in rooms she didn't immediately recognize and feel the contraction of fear before context arrived. She would carry all of it, but she was here. She was 24 years old and standing at the edge of the lake in the early morning of a city that didn't know her name, and she was choosing where to stand. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. Damian's hand came down from her face. He didn't step away, just shifted the contact, his hand finding hers, the kind of simple human arrangement that communicated something neither of them would have been able to articulate without making it smaller than it was. "We need to move," he said eventually. "Whatever comes next, it starts moving today, and we need to be ahead of it." "I know," Elena said. "It won't be simple." "I've never had simple," she said. "I don't think I'd know what to do with it." He looked at her for a moment, a short moment, just a breath, the look of a man confirming a decision he'd already made. And then he turned from the lake and began walking back toward the car, and she walked with him, and Reyes fell into step somewhere behind them at a distance that preserved the dignity of the moment without abandoning its function. The city opened up before them as they walked, not clean, not redeemed, not the version of an ending where the damage computes to zero and the account balances and the people who survived emerge into clarity. It was the other kind of ending, the kind that bore the honest weight of what it had cost. Two people shaped by violence, choosing each other in the aftermath of it, not because they were what the other person deserved, but because they were what the other person recognized. And because recognition, in the wreckage of a certain kind of life, was not nothing. It was, in fact, the only thing that mattered. The car was where they'd left it. The city was fully awake now, traffic building on the lakefront road, the sky completing its transition into the flat, cold gray of a Chicago winter morning. Elena got in the car. Damian got in beside her. Neither of them looked back at the lake. There was nothing behind them worth more than what was in front of them, which was not a destination yet, not a plan, not anything that would resolve cleanly into safety or simplicity. Just the road, just forward, just alive.